Okay, let's start talking about the document object model and Jquery, which as far as I'm concerned is absolutely the best way to deal with client-side JavaScript. And I hope the next few minutes convince you of why that is. So let's start out with a really simple example of what the DOM looks like schematically. And remember, the DOM is intended to be language independent, right? So the specification of the DOM really is in terms of what are the objects, what are the relationships among the objects, and what properties do those objects have. But the way that you represent that in any specific language is highly language dependent. So we'll show, of course, how you do it in JavaScript. Here's a little snippet of HTML. You can see that I've got, at its most basic, I have a paragraph element. The paragraph contains some text, and embedded in that text is another element, a span. And here's an example of what this would look like as in the document object model. This subtree would have as its root the p element. And the p element is actually going to have three different nodes in it. It's going to have some text that comes before the embedded tag. It's going to have some text that comes after the embedded tag. And it's going to have the embedded tag itself, which has one child node, which is the contents of the embedded tag. So you can see that both the element and the content of the element, if it has some content, are different kinds of nodes. And conveniently, Jquery gives you a way to sort of say, you know what, I just want all of the text that's inside this paragraph tag and just sort of flatten out any other embedded elements that happen to be in it. So you can do things like that. I included an example of one function that most browsers include in their JS API, not because I want you to use it, but to give you a sense of what the JS API looks like. So remember that I keep saying document is the value of the global object in a browser setting. It's a representation of the current document. And all of the functions that are available through the JS API, at some level, get access through that global object. So based on what you've already seen, what getElementById is just a property of the global object that is function valued. And it specifically will look for an element whose HTML element ID matches the string, or would match the string if I put the quote in the paren in the right place, and would return the JavaScript representation of that object. So obviously this has to be implemented by the browser, but it's made available, right? It's got a language binding to JavaScript. I'll fix the typo. But we won't use functions like that for the most part, because we will instead use the super awesome Jquery, which is a great framework that not only adds a lot of features way beyond what the browser's built-in JS API gives you, but it also fixes incompatibilities even across basic features that you would normally not need Jquery for anyway. So roughly speaking, there's basically no reason, in my opinion, not to use Jquery, even if you're just doing pretty simple stuff. Now, I mentioned before that because every HTML page has essentially its own copy of the interpreter in the global object, then you've got to make sure that JavaScript is loaded for every page that wants to use it. So does that mean that you have to load Jquery, which is a pretty sizable library, right? It's hundreds of kbytes, that you have to load it on every page? And by the way, Rails 3 includes it by default. If you do if you generate a new Rails app, you may not have noticed that Jquery is already included for you. If you don't want to load it from your own app directory, you can load it from Google. But either way, are we really talking about loading it on every page? Well, yes and no. The first time the user visits your app, they are going to download Jquery. Unless, for example, if you've served your Jquery off of Google servers, Google as a kind of public service provides hosted versions of a lot of public frameworks, including Jquery, so that your app can point to Google's version. They've optimized their version. It lives on fast servers, all the goodness. And if users have already visited other pages that loaded that same JavaScript file from the same server, they might not even have to load it at all, right? They may already have the same version of Jquery that you're pointing to because they visited a previous site. Even if they do have to load it for the first time when they visit your site, remember that by default, if you let Rails do its magic with the asset pipeline, that code has been minified, compressed, it's cached. It really only gets downloaded to the user's browser when it changes. So they only pay that hit the first time and not subsequently. So yes, technically, you have to ensure it's loaded on every page. But through a lot of caching, as long as you don't interfere with it, most users will never have to load it more than once until the next time you make changes in your application-specific JavaScript files. Jquery's interface to the world is remarkably clean. You basically do everything through a single polymorphic global function called Jquery, which is aliased as $. Yes, $sign is a legal variable name in JavaScript. Unfortunately, if you used to use an old framework called Prototype, it also defines $sign to refer to itself. So Jquery has an option called no conflict that you can say, don't define the $ alias for me. I will call everything explicitly using the name Jquery. In our examples, we're just going to use the $sign because I don't use any frameworks other than jQuery, so there's no possibility of a collision. Plus, it's shorter, and I like having fewer characters on the page, as you all know by now. Recall a polymorphic function. What does that mean? It means that the function does different things depending on the argument list that's passed to it. It's really a bunch of separate functions if you think of the argument list as helping you define the function's type. So we'll show there's 4 different ways to call it. We'll show the first 3 right away. And it can be a little tricky to keep them straight, but you get used to them really fast. So the first 2 ways that you can exploit the usefulness of this function is that you can call it with basically any CSS3 selector and get back a collection of elements that matches that selector. Warning, this is not the same as what you get back from getElementById. First of all, getElementById will only take an element ID. If that's what you want, then in jQuery you've got to do something like this, remembering that the # is the CSS notation for the element whose ID is movies. Here's any element whose class includes heading. Here's basically by tag, any element whose tag or element type is table. An equivalent version of this, and it's worth understanding why, just so that you don't feel like jQuery is magic. Suppose we took the window.document object. If we take an object handed back to us by the browser's JS API, in other words, the browser's internal representation of what the element is, that element is impoverished because it doesn't have jQuery superpowers, which we're going to talk about momentarily. But if I take an existing element type and I essentially call the $ function, the jQuery function, with that element as an argument, I get back a wrapped version that does have the jQuery superpowers. One of those superpowers is, starting at the subtree rooted on that element, find things that are matching some CSS selector. So it's just to show why this expression is essentially the equivalent of just calling this by itself with a CSS3 expression, right? But under the covers, somewhere along the line, jQuery is calling functions that are in the browser's JS API and then adding its own functionality on top of those functions. If you pass a selector that refers to multiple elements, you'll get back something that looks like an array, but it isn't quite. JavaScript is not quite as good at duck typing as Ruby. So you can't always reference the things as if they were array elements, but Java does provide an iterator that yields them one at a time. And there's an example of that in the book. The second way that you can use the $ function is you can use it to create an element. So if you just pass some HTML markup to it, what you'll get back is the jQuery wrapped representation of that element, which again is endowed with jQuery superpowers. So what are some of these awesome jQuery superpowers? I've reproduced part of a table here that's in the book. But these are things that you can do on jQuery-enabled elements that in general you cannot do if you got those same elements back just from the browser's raw JS API. Rather than go through the entire list, let me just show you a quick live demo of a couple of them. Here is the famous Rotten Potatoes homepage. I'm in Chrome, and I've opened up the JavaScript developer console on the bottom. And in case you've forgotten what this page looks like, let's see, we've got an h1 element, we've got a div whose ID is main. Let's see what we can do with some of these things. So what is the value of, if I just call this with an element type? Well, there's 2 of these. So what if we hide both of them? Can you guys see the bottom window? I don't know if I can zoom in or not. Oh, look at that. Sweet. I didn't know you could do that. OK, ready? Ooh. This is why you use jQuery, right? In reality, what's happening is there's a lot of CSS trickery going on to do the animation one step at a time. That's not a browser built-in behavior. That's jQuery goodness. Let's show them again. We can change its text to something else. And notice that there are 2 h1 elements that match my initial tag, so my command ended up applying to all of them. If that's not necessarily what you wanted, so what happened? It's not really an array. So there's an iterator that is provided called each. But really, the better thing to do, if you're already a step ahead of me, which I hope you are, is if you know you're going to want to do something to a certain element, make that element easy to identify. give it a unique ID, give it a class that's only shared by elements of that type. Maybe you know it's the only element that has that tag name on the page. But this is kind of a cornerstone of your JavaScript strategy, right? If you know that you're going to want to do something to an element, whether it's identify it or change it or be able to read its value, task number one is make it easy for your code to figure out which element that is. OK, let's jump away from jQuery for a moment to do a sanity check here about JavaScript's role in the browser. Suppose we're using JavaScript for client-side form validation, like in that lovely code that I showed a little while ago. Which statement is not true? You can inspect the DOM element attributes to see what the user typed. The JavaScript can prevent the submit button from actually submitting the form. That some validations might be impractical on the client, so you have to do them on the server. Or vice versa, the server doesn't have to repeat the validations that you've already done on the client. Which statement would you ban from the earth forever?